Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to week 2 of the Northwood University Summer Seminar in When We Are Free and the Northwood Idea. I am Tim Nash, and I am your host again this evening. It is my honor to start off the program tonight with just a bit of a recap of what we covered last week. As we noted, the Northwood Idea, or the philosophy of life, or the premise that we call the Northwood Idea, is really a fundamental point of reference for life. We try to teach our students that you need to have something that you can look to in times of crisis or in times of decision making that keeps you well grounded, that is the basis for good moral and ethical decisions and the basis for helping to make the world a better place and to make you as an individual and your family better individuals. And so just as a bit of a recap, one of the principles that Dr. Matchek was talking about last week is the principle of universality, meaning when somebody is talking about their philosophy, one of the great tests of that philosophy, whether or not they want you to adhere to that philosophy. And certainly the Northwood philosophy that we want everyone to accept. The opposite philosophy of a thief. Certainly a thief wants to steal from you, but doesn't want you to steal from him. And so the principle of universality is key with the Northwood Idea. The second point is, as we talk about the Northwood Idea, is the notion that incentives matter, that people need to have incentives in their lives. So the fact that pay is an incentive, job satisfaction is an incentive, the fact that producing a good product, buying a good product, seeing your children prosper, these are all incentives in life. And in a free society, incentives really matter and make a difference. And we ought to try to live in a world and be part of a world that produces as many incentives, not just for yourself, but for those that work for and with you, and for the people that you love and you surround yourself with. A third factor that's very important within the Northwood Idea is to understand that free people can and do accomplish great things. If you looked at the old Berlin Wall and you looked at East Germany versus West Germany, the thing that was amazing was that you had 5 times as many chemical engineers or electrical engineers in the old East Germany, but the GDP of East Germany was nowhere near the comparison of the GDP of West Germany, because the people weren't free. They weren't free to start their own businesses. They weren't free to compete. And when the Berlin Wall collapsed, you saw the fact that the East German economy became much more productive because the people were free. So you can see these examples in history of comparison of free people versus non-free people. And then another component of the Northwood Idea from last week is that when you think about what makes a world or what makes an economy interesting, what makes it unique and useful, is the fact that it's differences. We ought to, at every chance we get, celebrate our differences. The differences between a male and a female, the difference between an American and a Canadian, or a Canadian and a Brit, or a Brit and a person from China, or a person from China versus a person from India. Cultural differences, sociological differences that might involve religion, or might involve the kind of food you like, or the kind of food you don't think you like. How many times have you been to a restaurant and tried a new cuisine only to find out that you never thought you'd like it and you love it? I know for me, my wife is half Lebanese, and I grew up in Detroit near Dearborn, which is one of the largest Arabic populations outside of the Middle East. Never thought I'd like Middle Eastern food until I started dating my wife, and tonight we're having tabbouleh for dinner. And so the fact is that we learn to be better when we explore the differences among and between us. And finally, I finished last week talking about Bob McNair, who he and his wife Janice funded our McNair Center for the Advancement of Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship at Northwood University. And one of the things that Bob would say over and over again, the man came from nothing to become a billionaire. And when you asked him what he thought the greatest gift a person could give to another, he said probably the greatest gift was a job. And what we want to do at Northwood University is create a whole bunch of Bob and Janice McNairs. And so that's one of the reasons we're doing this seminar, and it's certainly why we have the courses at Northwood and the book When We Are Free. It is now my honor to turn the program over to one of our esteemed colleagues at Northwood, our academic dean for the undergraduate campus, and Dr. Patty Tim will be introducing another star at Northwood, Dr. Kristen Stayhauer. You met Kristen last week, and she will be our premier speaker tonight. And so without further ado, Dr. Tim, the program is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Nash. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristen Stayhauer, Northwood University Academic Vice President and Provost. It's easy to think of officers and administrators of colleges as just managers and administrators and lose sight of their backgrounds as faculty and scholars. But tonight, you get the opportunity to meet her as a scholar. Dr. Stayhauer earned her doctorate from Northwestern University in political science and international relations. Her scholarly work was focused on political and economic cooperation. In addition, she comes from a family of entrepreneurs and has extensive experience in strategic management, process improvement, and leadership development. She has taught in the areas of research methods and educational leadership at the doctoral level. She serves as a peer reviewer for the Higher Learning Commission and an examiner for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And she was appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to serve a 3-year term on the judges panel for the Baldrige Award. She has an extensive bio on our website, which you can take some time to read. But more important to me is that I work with her daily, and I can attest that she lives the mission and values of Northwood University each and every day. Her passion for the free market, entrepreneurship, and our code of ethics is evident. She likes to say that at Northwood University, we practice what we teach, and that is true. But at a personal level, she is a genuine and authentic leader who walks her talk and is a role model for those who work with her and for our students. Please welcome Dr. Kristen Stayhauer.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Truly an honor to be here this evening. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's truly a blessing for me to be able to serve this university and also to share with you my research, which really stems from an analysis of freedom and free enterprise and how powerful these powerful forces can be combined with visionary leadership to literally change the world. And that's what we do with the Northwood Education. Along with the invitation, you had a link to an article that I co-authored along with Dr. Nash, and it had to do with Ronald Reagan and his foreign policy and how he and his visionary leadership changed the world. And it's called Let's Win One for the Gipper. And what we'd like to do is start out, and if you had a chance to read it, fantastic. And if not, we hope that you'll be inspired after this to read the article. But we'd like to start out with an interactive poll, and we're trying this for the first time, so we hope that it will work. but you'll see that on the right-hand side of your screens, there's a little bubble above the Q&A icon that looks like a little bubble that a cartoon character might be speaking to. And we hope that you could answer this. We're just going to give you about 10 to 15 seconds to do that. And Dan, if you could display that, or Chris, please. That's out there. So the question is, the Gipper was the name of which U.S. president? Give you a moment. Okay, we're gonna close the poll. And let's see what our results are. Oh my goodness. You are the A class. 100% said Ronald Reagan. Fantastic. This is a good sign. I can't promise you that all your final exams will be this easy. The next one is a little harder, but it will also set some context for this. The bipolar world order during the Cold War referred to which two superpowers? Let's open that poll. Okay, and we'll close that one and see what we end up with. Oh my goodness. All right, well, you're acing this one. The Soviet Union and the United States. Had a kind of quasi-quick trick question in there with the United States and Russia, but the Soviet Union is the predecessor country to Russia, what we're now calling Russia. So way to go. So let's get to the content for tonight. And I'd like to give a little context about the field of international relations itself. In fact, one of the things we like to say is that states are not always nations, and nations are not always states. So when we're looking at international relations, we're looking at political bodies that are interacting across what we usually call state borders, meaning governmental borders, but nations may span those. And when we talk about Germany, and we're going to focus on East and West Germany and the German people, you'll see that we have a people that was separated and divided by a border. So as we look at that, what was the Cold War? So reference to the Cold War, we had two superpowers. You aced that part of the poll. And yes, it was the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, and we had a world that was divided in two, and it was bipolar, meaning everything was divided, almost everything in the globe was divided into two camps, and it was divided in a multitude of ways, including ideologically. And we had capitalism versus communism, and we also had the economic system, but also the political system, democracy versus the communist political system. We also had a philosophy or a situation that we had nuclear weapons. And why were the Soviet Union and the United States the two superpowers? When we look back, and we know for you students coming in that you haven't lived this like many of us did, but there were nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet Union, basically largely controlled, almost completely controlled by the Soviet Union and the United States. And so they were the two superpowers, and they were in a face-off with their ideological differences and different perspectives on politics and economics. And they basically had the weapons pointed at each other. And so we talked about mutual assured destruction, in that if one pulled the trigger and started launching nuclear missiles on the other country would automatically detect that and destroy the other. So it was a pretty awful situation growing up, thinking that at any moment, if somebody by mistake or on purpose pulled the nuclear trigger, we might all be destroyed. So MAD was actually, mutual assured destruction, was creating a peaceful coexistence, and we would put air quotes around how peaceful it was, because there were skirmishes throughout the world during this time, but of course never any nuclear conflagration between the United States and the Soviet Union. So we were living in times of great tension, but truly the end of the Cold War was thanks to visionary leadership and the triumph of democracy and freedom, and that ties to the Northwood idea and the Northwood philosophy. And I'm entering my 12th year at Northwood University, and I've chosen to invest my career in Northwood because I believe so much in our philosophy and our mission to develop the future leaders of a global free enterprise society. So all these things come together tonight. And as Dr. Nash mentioned, it's really important for us as leaders to ground ourselves in principles for decision making, because we don't always know what situations we might be dealing with in the future. But if we are principled and have solid values upon which we draw, we are going to be able to make better decisions, even in situations we can't anticipate. So as we move forward, I'd like to share with you the personal reason why I focused on the end of the Cold War and why it was of such personal interest to me. And I was blessed really to receive a Rotary Foundation Ambassadorial Scholarship. Those have now become Peace Scholars by the Rotary Foundation. Many of you may be familiar with Rotary International, the service organization. And I was fortunate enough to spend a year in Strasbourg, France, studying European Union law and studying international relations. And Strasbourg is on the border between France and Germany, and it's a sliver of land. It's a region that's now part of France, but has been passed between and fought over for hundreds of years between France and Germany, and the site of tremendous conflict over the years. And while I was there, I was standing on a mountaintop in the Vosges Mountains, and I was looking out over this vista and this tranquil scene over the Rhine River, over into the Black Forest Mountains, and really had a hard time believing that there had been so much conflict, violence, and carnage between two countries fighting over this region. And this is where my love of international relations started as well, because the peaceful scene and all of that conflict coming to a peaceful end was an inspiration. And I asked one of my Alsatian Rotarian friends whether he considered himself more German or more French. And he had grown up during World War II, so he was educated in the German system when it was part of Germany, and had been a successful businessman in the Alsatian region under France. And he said, I'm neither, I'm Alsatian. And so it gets us back to the idea that in international relations, nations are not always states, and states are not always nations. So Europe after World War II was divided into the East Bloc and the West Bloc, and this is how the bipolar world cascaded throughout different regions in the world. And we had the United States and our allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. Basically, almost all countries had an allegiance one way or the other, with the exception of Switzerland and a few others. But there was basically a political and economic division of the world, and it was the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, or the East and the West. There were a lot of different ways that we referred to it, but it was all basically the same thing. And even from a security and defense perspective, we had NATO, which was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the West, and the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet bloc side of that. So almost everything, everywhere you looked, was in one camp or the other. And Europe was really central to this global division, where we had Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And then within Europe, we had Germany, which was divided into East and West, two separate countries, one communist, one democratic, as Dr. Nash mentioned earlier. And then at the epicenter of all of that, we had Berlin, the capital of Eastern Europe, and a city that was divided basically into East and West. After World War II, the victorious countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Berlin into 4 sectors. And eventually there was the rift between the communist side of the world and the democratic side of the world. And so the Soviet Union built what we referred to as the Berlin Wall. Dr. Nash mentioned that as well, the Berlin Wall, to then make that sector intact. And in fact, all of Berlin had a big, it was fortified around it because it was an island. The western side of Berlin was basically an island within the communist Soviet bloc. We also called that division the Iron Curtain. So if you ever hear that, that's what that meant. So the Berlin Wall was put up. And if we could show the first slide, President John F. Kennedy was speaking in Berlin in June of 1963. And he said, there are many people in the world who really don't understand what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. That's where it was side by side, juxtaposed freedom and democracy and communism and a controlled economy. He also said, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. That's the situation that Berlin was and all of Eastern Europe. Let's fast forward, and if we could take the slide down for a moment now, we'll come back to the another quote that is pivotal. But Berlin Wall really then became a symbol of the Cold War division. And enter Ronald Reagan in the height of the Cold War, and he even accelerated the nuclear arms race with what was called the Star Wars Defense Initiative. And what he was trying to do, he had scientists working on, and he was rallying our resources in the United States to basically create a missile defense system. So that meant if the Soviets launched a missile attack, we could actually deflect it and we wouldn't be destroyed. That was going to destabilize mutual assured destruction. Sounds good to defend yourself, but it also was seen as a possible destabilizing force. If you have a perfect defense, then you don't have to worry about the other side's offense. And that could have, tensions rose very high at that point. And the Soviets then joined in that race and that strategic defense to have the counterbalance to what we were calling Star Wars or the Strategic Defense Initiative. And so as we look at all of this, the Soviet situation, the economy was not as strong as they were portraying. They were masters of propaganda. And this was something that, in retrospect, we were able to gain a clearer understanding that this actually destabilized the Soviet economy quite a bit. They were pouring all these resources into having a counterbalance to the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it may have hastened their demise. So Ronald Reagan, and if you have not heard him speak, he was called the Great Communicator, and you can go on YouTube and you can find speeches that he made. Very warm and charismatic speaker, just would make you feel great about being an American as he spoke, and really had a great following. And so as the Great Communicator, he made some bold moves, and one of them was in 1986. So the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990. So this was one of the precursors. He accelerated the arms race, and then at the 1986 summit in Reykjavik, he suggested the zero option, which meant reducing tremendously and certain missiles all the way to zero. And that was seen as kind of a crazy idea at the time. And so that was something that was a bold move. And people were wondering at the time, is he losing it? This seems like such a crazy idea. How does this fit with the Strategic Defense Initiative? And there was quite a bit of speculation as to whether he still had it together, actually, as a president. And if we could go to the next slide, please. President Reagan went to Berlin on June 12th, 1987, and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. At the time, the press thought that this was just posturing and it was just a kind of a media stunt for him to do that. But in retrospect, it was absolutely a demonstration of visionary leadership. So if we could go to just, we could exit the slides there. So there was unrest, and more than the West realized, there was unrest in the East. And what happened was, getting back to President Kennedy saying we didn't have to keep our people in. Well, the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet bloc, was having trouble keeping their people in. And there was an out-migration from East Germany because it was seen to be one of the most repressive regimes in the whole Soviet bloc. And that they were moving into Hungary, which was one of the more bordering on democratic, even in the Eastern Bloc, but they were a bit more, probably humane regime. And so East Germans were moving into Hungary. And in 1989, Hungary opened its border to Austria. So Hungarians were starting to be able to pass between Hungary and Austria, Austria being part of the West, although it was kind of straddling the two politically behind the scenes. And East Germans started going into Hungary. So you can imagine, you've got the East Germans going into Hungary, and the Hungarians are able to go to the West in Austria. And in September 1989, the Hungarian government, not the East German government, but the Hungarian government allowed East Germans to leave Hungary for Austria, and they started to do that in big numbers. At the same time, even under these repressive political regimes, there were peaceful demonstrations throughout different cities in Eastern Europe, and we saw a great deal of activity there, but not a lot of press coverage because they controlled the media so extensively. But still, through our intelligence sources, we were able to find out that these demonstrations were taking place. We're going to fast forward. So all these people are moving, and they're moving and they're demonstrating. And in November of 1989, November 9th, 1989 specifically, East Germany opened the Berlin Wall and allowed East Berliners to go into West Berlin. And this unleashed euphoria and fear at the same time, because at these different checkpoints, and one of the most famous ones being Checkpoint Charlie, so if you see movies or read books about it, that was one of the most famous checkpoints in the Berlin Wall where people could pass through. They had shoot-to-kill orders. So if anybody breached the wall or climbed over it or went through it without permission, they had shoot-to-kill orders. But the guard, and that's a whole fascinating story in itself, would love to go into that at another time, but the guard chose not to shoot, and people started flowing. Masses of people started flowing into West Berlin. And Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor of West Germany at the time, just a few weeks later, and here's another example of visionary leadership, he announced a 10-point plan for the unification of Germany. And who knew that that would really precipitate the whole unraveling of the Cold War and the whole bipolar world order where the Soviet Union and the US were facing off directly against each other. So at the time, Helmut Kohl's advisors estimated, and this is in private conversations, they estimated that it would take probably 5 to 10 years for that 10-point plan to ultimately lead to German unification. There were a certain number of things, and there was 10 steps. He made it simple. This is a lesson to all of us too. Have a plan, be ready with your plan, have a plan, keep it simple, and make it very actionable. It had to do with currency, it had to do with other types of things that had to go into place. On the Western side, and my area of special focus was French foreign policy, and talking about, and getting it back to my experiences in the Alsatian region of France. They had great concerns. They had been invaded by Germany multiple times over the course of history. Peaceful relations right now with West Germany, and they definitely were, France and Germany were at the core, and continue to be to a great extent, the core of the European Union. But they were in a bind because now Helmut Kohl lays out the 10-point plan and 10 simple steps, actually not so simple, but 10 steps to the unification of Germany. All of a sudden, Germany now is a lot more powerful and has this tremendous economic weight and natural resources right in the middle of Europe. So actually, the French side had concerns about it. Great Britain got involved behind the scenes, and George Bush, who was ultimately president throughout this period, navigated it absolutely brilliantly, because at any point, really, in a way, it's a miracle that this did not result in violent conflict. But the leaders were visionary enough to be able to hold it together, and ultimately, the 10-point plan came to fruition, and less than 1 year later, Germany was unified. So there were negotiations, and we're focused on the 2+4 talks, the two Germanys plus the four victorious countries after World War II. And all those behind-the-scenes wranglings were absolutely fascinating. But Helmut Kohl's 10-point plan basically was enacted, and by less than a year later, something that was thought to would have taken 5 to 10 years, it was accomplished. So when we think about the relevance of these concepts today, and if we could take a look at the last slide, it makes me really think about the Northwood Code of Ethics and our values as a university. Our Code of Ethics, we remember it by the acronym FRESH AIR: freedom, responsibility, empathy, spirituality, honesty, achievement, integrity, and respect. We think about the end of the Cold War and the principled approaches that our leaders took to ending it peacefully. Absolutely, like I said, it's almost a miracle that it happened as peacefully as it did. And I think it was the principled leadership and also the respect of the other side, working with Mikhail Gorbachev to basically allow him to make the concessions he needed to make to allow this to happen peacefully. And then at Northwood University, we believe in individual freedom and personal responsibility. And we think at the core of what Ronald Reagan accomplished, George Herbert Walker Bush, our president at the time of the unification of Germany and the unraveling of the Cold War, and how Helmut Kohl acted, really all of that came together. At Northwood, like I said before, we developed the future leaders of a global free enterprise society. We're giving you a very powerful toolkit. Not only will you have the education in the areas that you'll be majoring in, but also in our philosophy and the toolkit that goes with that to exercise those individual freedoms responsibly and quite literally change the world. We talked about mutual assured destruction, MAD, which is something that's a international relations concept. But at Northwood University, we talk about go MAD. And for us, that means make a difference. Go make a difference. Go change the world. You're going to be getting those skills, getting that toolkit, getting that education, and those hands-on experiences to allow you to change the world. I'll hand it over to Dr. Nash and hope that we have some questions.
Dr. Stayhauer, as always, a home run. That was a wonderful talk. The article that Kristen and I wrote on the true accomplishments of Ronald Reagan is a must-read, as she noted, and it's largely because of her contributions to the paper. In terms of getting ready to turn the Q&A session back over to Dr. Tim, one of the things that I think is very important is to note that you notice that Dr. Stayhauer noted that free people that are responsible, that are moral and ethical, tying our thoughts together, they can and they do accomplish great things. And one of the points that I would make as an add-on to Dr. Stayhauer's wonderful words is that individuals can make a great difference. And you see some that are successful and some that are not. Well, oftentimes it's their ability to make the right choices. But if you study, we're privileged at Northwood to do the annual study for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce comparing the 50 states. Why are some states more successful economically than others? Well, it has to do with choices that they make with tax policy or regulatory policy. And then as Kristen noted, look at countries. Countries either make good decisions or they don't. And, her wonderful comparison between East Germany and West Germany, lack of freedom and an abundance of freedom in the West. And now you look at the unified Germany being one of the great economies of the world once again. I would also say that as you come to Northwood to study, there's a great comparison that you will have the privilege of studying, and it's a little scary to look at Hong Kong versus China, because you have a very free Hong Kong and you have a Chinese economy that is becoming more free. But there are conflicts between China and Hong Kong right now that we all hope are resolved to the betterment of both countries and to the world economy as a whole. So the opportunity to take the good words of Dr. Stayhauer and use it as a launching pad to many different areas of study at Northwood. I hope you do as she said. If you haven't read the chapter on the Gipper, please do so. Next week is our wrap-up session. Our own Chris Deming will be our moderator. Our speakers will be Delois Liebhart, who's a professor of law, our Dean of Students, Andy Kripe, and wrapping up the session next week will be our president, Dr. Kent McDonald. And you have a great treat with all three of those. And so it is my honor to turn the program over for questions and answers back to our esteemed undergraduate academic dean, Dr. Patty Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Nash, and thank you, Dr. Stayhauer, for a wonderful recap of what is very memorable for many of us and is not as familiar to our incoming freshmen. So we do have the question and answer area under the Q&A if you have any questions for Dr. Stayhauer. While we're waiting for more questions, I will start it out. So what was the pivotal moment in the peaceful ending of the Cold War, in your opinion?
It's hard to identify just one, but there are a couple of important points. And one was the Open Skies Summit in Ottawa, Canada. And this is when the foreign policy, the Secretary of State and his counterparts, so we're able to basically agree that the 10-point plan could roll forward. And so this was the United States and Germany and the Soviet Union basically able to agree that if this all would happen. I still think there was a suspension of belief in whether that could happen, but they had the behind-the-scenes agreement that allowed the 10-point plan to roll forward. Another moment was when President Bush was talking with Gorbachev, and they made a deal because there were big payments that the West made to the Soviet Union, the United States made to the Soviet Union, and it was kind of like the Marshall Plan, but different in terms of it wasn't as widely known, but Gorbachev was negotiating pretty hard. Later, they found out that they could have probably gotten away with a lot less, but they were able to, and it was really funds to stabilize the former Soviet economy. It was still the Soviet Union at the time, but it didn't take long before it became Russia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. So how much of a role did the United Kingdom have in the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Well,
Any questions?
Margaret Thatcher was the leader then, and she was known as the Iron Lady. And what an amazing leader she was. And she was very strong behind the scenes. And she was one of the ones who was a stickler for making sure that the United Germany wouldn't overtake the rest of Europe. And we've seen the independent streak of the UK play out a number of times, and we've seen them go with their own currency rather than going with the euro, and then also pulling out of the European Union, all of those activities. So the UK definitely had sovereignty concerns about a very strong and unified Germany. She kept that behind the scenes, out in public, was very supportive, just like France was. But there were talks between François Mitterrand, who was the leader of France at the time, and Margaret Thatcher about their concerns about a strong Germany dominating Europe.
Thank you. Let's see. So we always hear people say, I'm Switzerland. So what do you think drove Switzerland to stay neutral?
Oh, that's a tricky one, Dr. Tim. Part of it's geography. They have natural fortifications of the Alps and the mountains that form its natural borders. So that's an aspect that just for centuries has allowed Switzerland to have an ability to be neutral. They also have tremendously strong banking systems, and so being a neutral place has been advantageous for all to know that their money is safe there. And then they are they have very strong military. They have mandatory military service, and so to be neutral, one has to be strongly armed as well. So nobody comes in and takes over. So that's it's a very active stance. Sometimes it's seen as a neutral, being neutral as being a passive stance, but in fact, it definitely takes a very active policy to remain neutral, especially in the world that was clearly divided into the two camps during the Cold War.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question because I think we're getting to the end of the questions. And this is more of a personal question for you. So based on your research, you've talked about some leaders that have accomplished the unimaginable. Out of all of your research, how has that informed your leadership style?
Oh my goodness! And yes, and we work together every day. So this is really George Herbert Walker Bush. So the first President Bush is somebody who has really been an inspiration to me. The way he calmly allowed this to unfold and he was criticized for not basically dancing on the Berlin Wall or showing too much effusive joy about the fact that the Berlin Wall came down, because he knew that could destabilize the situation. And ultimately, in many respects, that was a contributing factor to not being reelected. There were other things as well. His No New Taxes pledge definitely worked against him as well. But he was so principled, and he was not a flashy leader, but he was really solid. And having read his biography, what an amazing man. And he was in a position where he just really, I think he was the linchpin to this all happening so peacefully. And the end of the Cold War is one of the biggest events in our time. So he's at the top of my list, but so is Ronald Reagan.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're at the end of our questions, and thank you so much, Dr. Stayhauer, Dr. Nash. This has been a very educational and an enlightening event, and I especially want to thank all of you who have attended for your time tonight, and most importantly, for your desire to learn more about what makes Northwood University unique, and that's the Northwood idea. So thank you, enjoy your evening, and good night.